In 1941, Britain was broke, but the world didn't know it yet. The empire that once owned a quarter of the earth had run out of dollars, gold, and time. And so it signed a deal that looked like salvation, but functioned like extraction. The Lend-Lease Act, a phrase that sounds generous, almost noble. Arsenal of democracy, Roosevelt called it. Weapons and supplies sent freely to allies fighting tyranny. But beneath the rhetoric was a quiet shift in global power, one that turned a collapsing empire into a debtor state. Here's the paradox. Britain received tanks, planes, and food without payment, yet every shipment deepened a dependency measured not in pounds or dollars, but in sovereignty. For each crate unloaded in Liverpool, London's financial independence shrank, and across the Atlantic, Washington's leverage grew, silently, mathematically. Some historians describe Lend-Lease as an act of wartime generosity. Others see it as a masterstroke of economic colonization. Because while Britain fought to preserve its empire, the mechanism of aid was already dismantling it. Consider this. The British Empire had accumulated assets over centuries, mines, railways, trade routes. But after 1941, those assets became bargaining chips. Each negotiation with Washington meant selling a piece of the imperial body to keep its heart beating. And when the war ended, the bill arrived, not in cash, but in conditions. Access to colonies, trade liberalization, dollar convertibility. Lend-Lease wasn't a gift, it was a restructuring plan, enforced through dependence. The irony is stark. Britain won the war, yet lost the world it fought to defend. Its victory was paid for in credit, and credit is never free. Imagine this, a global empire rescued by another power, only to wake up and find itself absorbed into a new one, financial, invisible, and permanent. That is the hidden story of Lend-Lease, not a lifeline, but a quiet handover. To understand the weight of Lend-Lease, we have to return to the late 1930s, the twilight of Britain's financial supremacy. London was still the world's clearinghouse. Sterling was the global currency of trade. But beneath the polished surface, the foundations were crumbling. Decades of overextension had drained Britain's reserves. The Great Depression had weakened exports, the gold standard had collapsed, and maintaining a worldwide military presence became a slow bleed of capital. By 1939, the empire's wealth was real only on maps, not in vaults. When war began, Britain paid for American weapons and supplies in dollars. At first, this seemed manageable. But as the Luftwaffe bombed London and ships sank in the Atlantic, British gold reserves fell, fast. By the end of 1940, only about 2 million ounces of gold remained accessible for payments abroad. In practical terms, the empire was illiquid. Washington saw it clearly. President Roosevelt understood that Britain couldn't continue buying arms without collapsing its currency. So the United States proposed something revolutionary, or at least it sounded so. Instead of cash, Britain would receive supplies on credit. No immediate payment, no default risk, just lend and lease. But nothing in economics is ever free. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, allowed the U.S. president to supply military goods to any nation vital to the defense of the United States. The words were diplomatic. The intent was strategic. Through this act, Washington could support Britain, keep the war going against Germany, and, crucially, preserve its own neutrality long enough to build industrial momentum. Every ship, every aircraft carrier built under Lend-Lease expanded not only the Allied arsenal, but also America's manufacturing infrastructure. The United States was arming the world and billing the future. Meanwhile, Britain's position shifted from lender to borrower. For 2 centuries, London had financed wars and dictated terms. Now it had to accept them. Gold shipments were replaced with promissory notes, and once the reserves were gone, the empire began liquidating its overseas investments, railways in Latin America, oil interests in the Middle East, shares in Canadian companies. It was like selling the walls to keep the roof from falling. By 1942, Britain's net overseas assets had fallen by more than 1/3. Each year of war deepened the imbalance. And as the Americans delivered ships, trucks, and food, they also delivered accountants. Every item was tracked, every ton of steel logged. It wasn't chaos, it was a precise, technocratic form of control. The contrast is striking. Britain fought for survival with borrowed weapons. America built an empire with invoices. And when the guns fell silent in 1945, one nation was exhausted, the other industrially reborn. Some would later say that Lend-Lease was a symbol of unity, but economically it marked a transfer of power more decisive than any battlefield victory. The center of global finance began to drift, from the City of London to Wall Street. The world changed currency without realizing it. If this gave you a clearer picture of how the empire began to fade, comment where you're watching from. By 1943, the illusion of partnership had started to crack. Britain called it Allied cooperation. Washington called it program efficiency. Both were describing the same reality: control through supply. The numbers tell the story better than any speech. By that year, the United States had shipped over $4 billion worth of goods to Britain: aircraft, ammunition, vehicles, fuel, even food for civilians. And yet, the deeper the aid, the weaker Britain's financial position became, because every ton of wheat or steel was recorded as an obligation, not a gift. The crisis wasn't about debt in the traditional sense, it was about leverage. Washington now had full visibility into Britain's finances: balance sheets, reserves, import plans, even colonial accounts. Every transaction required coordination with American agencies. The British government, still fighting a global war, found itself audited by its ally. Behind the scenes, American officials like Harry Dexter White and Dean Acheson drafted memoranda that redefined the post-war order. They were not negotiating victory terms, they were designing dependency. Access to future aid, shipping, and fuel was tied to Britain's compliance with these new financial structures. One example stands out. In 1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day, the U.S. Treasury quietly reminded Britain that any post-war dollar purchases would require full convertibility of the pound. It sounded like technical jargon, but it meant that the empire's currency, the glue holding together its trade network, would be exposed to global markets overnight. Convertibility stripped Britain of its last defense against dollar domination. Churchill, pragmatic yet proud, understood the trap. He called the Lend-Lease system the most unsorted act in history. The phrase sounded noble. In fact, it was a coded admission. Britain couldn't afford to criticize the very mechanism keeping it alive. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Britain expected a period of transition. Instead, within weeks, Washington halted Lend-Lease without warning. Factories stopped, ships remained unloaded, and government planners panicked. Essential goods, food, raw materials, even medical supplies, were suddenly frozen mid-transit. In London, the Treasury calculated the immediate shortfall. Around $3.5 billion worth of supplies were pending. The war was over, but the bills had arrived all at once. Britain's foreign exchange reserves were almost empty. Gold stocks were down to a few $100 million worth. And yet, reconstruction, feeding and housing millions of returning soldiers, had barely begun. This was the breaking point. The United States, fully aware of Britain's vulnerability, offered a solution, a massive post-war loan. The Anglo-American Financial Agreement of 1946 promised $3.75 billion in credit, but with sharp conditions: pound-dollar convertibility, trade liberalization, and the end of imperial preference within the Commonwealth. It was not just a loan, it was a forced restructuring of Britain's economic system. Within a year of signing it, the pound collapsed, colonies began moving toward independence, and the old trade networks fractured beyond repair. The empire hadn't been defeated by arms, it had been dissolved through accounting. And the true cost of Lend-Lease became visible only when the ink dried, not in factories or fields, but in the quiet balance sheets of a collapsing world order. Lend-Lease was never just a law, it was a system built on logistics, finance, and dependency, woven so tightly that it became invisible. At its core, the mechanism was simple. The U.S. supplied goods to Britain and its allies for the duration of the war, with repayment to be discussed later. But later was the key word. It postponed the cost while locking in the relationship. The British Treasury had to open its books to American administrators. Every purchase, every requisition went through Washington's Lend-Lease administration, an entire bureaucracy designed to track the flow of resources. Weapons and raw materials didn't move freely, they followed policy. On paper, Britain received around $31 billion in aid, but the structure of this aid turned power into a formula. Each shipment carried metadata: the where, the when, the why. That data created a complete map of Britain's wartime economy, and whoever controls the map controls the movement. The first layer of control was physical. Britain received goods that could not be easily produced at home: aircraft engines, Liberty ships, trucks, machine tools, essential infrastructure. By 1944, nearly half of all British merchant tonnage came from American shipyards. That meant supply chains, repair parts, and even training now depended on U.S. standards. Dependency disguised as modernization. The second layer was financial. Payment was deferred, but obligations were recorded. The British exported what they could, raw materials, patents, military designs, to offset some of the balance. But these were symbolic gestures. The real currency was access to bases, markets, and post-war influence. The third layer was political. Lend-Lease required that Britain coordinate its foreign procurement through the Combined Raw Materials Board, an Anglo-American body headquartered in Washington. Its purpose was efficient distribution. In practice, it gave the U.S. Treasury a seat inside Britain's war economy. No major colonial shipment of tin, rubber, or oil left port without American oversight. Empire turned transparent. By 1945, the mechanism had done its work. Britain's industrial capacity was intact, but its independence was not. The American dollar had quietly replaced sterling as the currency of coordination. When the war ended, the machine didn't stop, it simply changed shape. The post-war loan agreement was the logical continuation of Lend-Lease accounting. The U.S. canceled remaining deliveries, then offered new credit, with strings attached. Dollar lending replaced material aid, and the interest was no longer financial, but structural: open trade, dollar convertibility, and the gradual dismantling of imperial preference. Through this logic, the empire became a subsystem. Its trade routes, once radiating from London, now looped through Washington. Every import, every export, every currency decision was measured against dollar reserves. Britain hadn't lost its navy or its army, it had lost its monetary anchor. What began as wartime cooperation evolved into a blueprint for global management. The same administrative logic that tracked shells and tanks during the war now governed loans, aid programs, and development funds across the post-war world. Lend-Lease had proved one thing: control doesn't require conquest, only accounting. And from that moment on, the empire's greatest export was not goods, but dependence. By 1947, the empire that had once financed the world could no longer finance itself. The numbers were unambiguous. Britain's dollar reserves had collapsed from $2.5 billion to less than $500 million within a single year. The grand illusion of solvency vanished overnight. The convertibility clause, that technical term buried in the Anglo-American loan agreement, detonated first. Once the pound became exchangeable for dollars, markets rushed to convert. Within weeks, Britain lost nearly a quarter of its reserves. The Treasury froze convertibility, but the damage was done. Confidence had evaporated. Control had slipped away. This wasn't a political event. It was a financial implosion. The world that had revolved around sterling shifted its orbit to the dollar. And that meant something deeper than currency change. It meant a new center of gravity. Trade routes began to reorient. American corporations replaced British ones in India, the Middle East, and Latin America. Even within the Commonwealth, preference agreements, once the glue of imperial trade, were dismantled under U.S. pressure. The language of free markets became the polite vocabulary of economic displacement. At home, austerity replaced ambition. Rationing continued years after victory. The government nationalized industries, not out of ideology, but necessity. Private capital had fled or gone bankrupt. Reconstruction turned into triage. Britain wasn't rebuilding an empire, it was managing decline. The colonies saw it first. India, Egypt, and Malaya realized that London no longer dictated global finance. The empire's promise of stability had vanished. Decolonization wasn't just political awakening. It was a liquidity crisis turned ideological. When the pound weakened, the empire's authority dissolved with it. Washington moved quickly to fill the vacuum. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, extended the Lend-Lease logic to all of Europe. Aid was tied to market access and dollar settlements. It was a new empire, built not on colonies, but on contracts. And Britain, the original creditor of the modern world, now stood in line as a recipient. The irony was almost architectural. In 1939, the world's gold and trade routes converged on London. By 1950, they flowed to New York. Sterling had become a regional currency. The dollar had become law. Lend-Lease had done what centuries of war could not. It had inverted the financial map of the planet. Inside Whitehall, a few officials still tried to calculate the true cost. One of them, economist Lionel Robbins, wrote in his diary, "We are living through the liquidation of a civilization." He wasn't exaggerating. The empire had not fallen. It had been liquidated through credit terms. The post-war settlement had a winner, but it wasn't on the battlefield. It was the system that learned how to turn debt into dominance. History tends to remember wars as struggles of courage, but sometimes victory belongs to the one who sends the invoice. History rarely repeats itself in costume. It reappears in policy. The same pattern that began with Lend-Lease still governs the world today, only the language has changed. Then it was called aid. Today it's called stability. Then it was about tanks and trucks. Now it's about liquidity and loans. But the essence remains identical, dependency wrapped in generosity. After 1945, the Lend-Lease mechanism evolved into global institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and later, the network of dollar-based finance that defines the modern era. Each was built on the same logic: credit as leverage, assistance as architecture. Nations no longer fall through invasion, they fall through adjustment. In the 1950s, Britain still believed it could manage decline. It built the Commonwealth, issued soft loans, and maintained bases abroad. But every crisis, Suez in 1956, the pound devaluation in 1967, the IMF bailout of 1976, showed the same invisible hand at work. Aid came with arithmetic. Each condition, each interest rate, each structural reform deepened the pattern first perfected under Lend-Lease. And now, look around. The same blueprint stretches across continents. When a country's currency collapses, when it signs a stabilization package, when it accepts assistance tied to liberalization, it's the same equation, translated into the language of our century. Debt became the new empire. It doesn't need flags or fleets. It only needs signatures. The United States learned from Lend-Lease that control can be administered through contracts rather than conquest. And by the 21st century, the model had been refined into a global operating system. Dollar reserves replaced colonies. Credit ratings replaced governors. Development programs replaced protectorates. Britain's post-war experience was the prototype, a world power reduced to a client state through the machinery of goodwill. What began as a wartime alliance became a template for a new kind of hierarchy, one measured in interest rates and foreign exchange, not territory. Today, the same tools apply in different hands. Wherever capital flows in the name of rescue, sovereignty flows out. Currency swaps, sanctions, emergency funding, all echoes of that first experiment in 1941. The phrases are softer now: economic partnership, monetary coordination, financial assistance. But behind them lies the same principle that dismantled the British Empire: the transfer of control through credit. Each new crisis revives the mechanism. Each solution extends it. The paradox remains. Empires no longer die by force. They are outsourced by finance. And the victors don't march. They underwrite. The true legacy of Lend-Lease is not the memory of tanks and convoys, but the architecture of obligation it left behind. It taught the modern world that dependence could be standardized and monetized. History didn't change, only the labels did. 80 years later, the crates are gone, the ships dismantled, the paperwork yellowed. But the system that began with Lend-Lease still hums quietly beneath global finance. It doesn't need a signature anymore. It's built into the software of money itself. Every international rescue, every coordinated support package still carries the same invisible clause: obedience through dependence. Nations don't surrender armies now. They surrender options. And each time a government borrows to survive, it replays in miniature the British bargain of 1941. The empire that once measured its power in gold and colonies now measures its relevance in credit ratings. The transition is complete. The map of control no longer has borders. It has balance sheets. Lend-Lease was not just an episode of wartime necessity. It was the prototype for the world's operating system. A revelation disguised as relief, a transfer of empire through arithmetic. And perhaps the most striking part is this. The actors changed, but the script did not. Every age finds its own Lend-Lease, a promise of help that quietly rewrites the hierarchy. History doesn't repeat, it recalculates.